Welcome to Colonie TV, the governmental educational channel for the town of Colonie.
It goes all my life's a circle, sunrise and sundown. The moon rolls through the nighttime till the daybreak comes around. And all my life's a circle, I can't tell you why. Seasons spinning round again, the years keep rolling by.
Top of the evening. I'm Joe Doolittle.
And good morning, I'm Kate Dudding.
And this is Story by Story.
Sharing the human experience.
And Kate and I are storytellers and story producers, and we're aficionados of the spoken word, which is another way of saying that we like to tell stories, and we like to listen to stories, and we like to encourage other people to do that too.
Both of those. Tell their stories and listen to others.
Yeah. Kate, the waning days of summer are with us, and we've had erratic weather all around the country. We had a rainy Labor Day here in the Northeast. But I'm wondering, sometimes that kind of turbulence, does that produce stories? Is that kind of a crisis in wait of resolution? Thank you so much for that word.
Well, let's see. Storyteller Sib Lieberman created a story about the
Johnstown
flood in Pennsylvania, which was a horrifying event, which thankfully, even though the flooding of Schoharie Valley was bad enough, I mean, we're talking houses and people and, just gone.
So turbulence, often produces kinds of opportunities for stories, and similarly, I think, I've always been a fan of like love stories, where two people get together and go smooch, something like that. I kind of like those kinds of stories. What are your favorite stories?
Like a terrier with a bone.
Who is that off?
I don't know. It's someone from the peanut gallery. Well, the kind of stories that I develop are of people who made a difference. But I love listening to other kinds of stories. I just listened to one on the internet, and I'll be one of the slides is there's going to be an online storytelling festival.
Wonderful.
In October, and Geraldine Buckley told a story about being a new chaplain in a prison and how she negotiated with the leader of the biggest gang as to not to hold, shall we say, business meetings of his in the back of the chapel when she was trying to hold a service in the front of the chapel. She finally came to the realization that she needed to say, the chapel is my turf. And just like you don't let anyone, when you're out, take over your turf, your street corner, I can't let anyone take over mine.
And I have the big guy on my side, right? Kind of that.
Well, no, she said, I want to handle it between us. But if I have to, I can ban all of you and your gang from coming to my services. But I don't want to do that. And he understood, and he said, we won't do that anymore. And he kept his word.
There you go.
So that was
now, when
amazing.
We first started to talk about storytelling, you may have gotten the impression that we were talking about like fairy tales, although that's part of a story. That's kind of story. But we're talking about the method of how we entertain and teach each other, how we share joy, how we share pain, how we get along with each other. And there's some method to that. And if you want some examples of that, it's nice to know that storytelling is online. We're going to talk about a storytelling festival, if you will, that's virtual, that you can join right on your computer. And if you want to go to your computer, one of the things about this show is that we now have over
100 stories from these shows on our website, storycircle@proctors.org. Click on YouTube.
and they're there, and they're guest tellers from this show, and they're remarkable.
And 20,000 stories have been viewed from.
That's right. So we know that people like those stories. And
Well, we did have a few misguided people. Margaret French had
You
a story.
talking about me again?
No, not now. That got to Margaret French's story of homemade baked beans. And I could see that there was a big drop-off after about the first 15 seconds when they realized, no, this was not a recipe for homemade, I assume this was not a recipe for homemade baked beans. It was a story about homemade baked beans. But,
so we don't have recipes, but we have a lot of good stories about a lot of good things. And you know, we're going to come back in a bit and talk about coming events and ways you can hear and listen and maybe tell stories yourself. But there's this thing about this guest teller, because every show we have a guest teller from the region.
who usually doesn't speak until they've been introduced, but
She's always been
storytellers are, it's like herding cats,
Christy Keegan is our guest storyteller, and Christy is living in Saratoga for many years. They don't call her a native quite yet, but she's been there long enough to qualify, I'm sure. And I've had the wonderful opportunity to tell stories with her in various places, and it's always been, well, it's never dull. Never dull.
And we like her very much.
We
That's
like her very
the
much.
only reason why we would tease her so
And
much.
we would teach her so much. So welcome, Christy Keegan, to our show.
Well, thank you.
Once
Thank you
again.
Thank you for having me here. I love being here. Thank you.
Now you may think from the way she's smiling and carrying on that she's just kind of a smiler and a carry-on. She's not. She's done some serious things in women's issues and women's health, and we're quite proud of her professionally.
And a story that she may be telling at Celebration, she was spunky as a 9-year-old. Probably she was spunky as a 1-year-old.
I think she's been spunky, period.
Yes.
Although the one thing, whenever I meet you, Christy, I think about the conversation we had, and I don't know how old you were, but I know it was probably one of the spunkier things, because you packed your Volkswagen Bug and you spent a year plus on the raid.
Year and a half.
A year and a half. And you were like in your 20s.
No, it's 45.
You were 45 when you did
45
it?
years old when I did that.
This was like a midlife crisis that put you on the road? I never realized that. I always thought it was when you were kind of younger, but you actually did one of these Charles Corral on the road things.
I dropped out of graduate school. I decided I didn't want an MBA from Simmons, although it is a wonderful school. I hope I don't offend anybody. They had a class on how one should dress, and it included wearing clear stockings and high heels. I realized I was probably in the wrong place. I said goodbye to my advisor, packed my bag, and left.
Just like that.
Just like that.
Holy crow. I didn't realize it was high heels and clear stockings that had set you on the road.
Well, I imagine there were a few other things.
There were.
This was probably the tipping point.
The tipping point.
Yeah, that's very much the Reader's Digest version.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
But at the same time, you have your life and your stories are informed by both your childhood, which is wonderful to hear about, and your life. And one of my favorite stories is your favorite dress. That was, and if you want to see somebody tell a story, you ought to hear her tell that story. I'll tell you. Boy, oh boy, I'll tell you. So that there are things that we all remember about you. But it started, as I remember, this whole connection with story started in Boston, and it started in a zoo. How's that for half a memory?
It's
I'm
typical.
impressed.
I mean, not a surprise that zoos and Christie are
Right.
well connected.
I would say it was easier. I started as a docent at the Franklin Park Zoo, and for 5 years I was amazed that they let me go to the zoo 16 hours a weekend for nothing. They got animal care out of me. They certified me as an exotic animal handler. And part of my job was to educate the public about animals. And I didn't want to anthropomorphize them. On the other hand, I thought it was good to set the animals in a context, a cultural context, which meant taking stories from the culture and the country where the animals came from, and giving people an idea about why they might use different animals for different things. And so the very first story I ever told was called Traveling to Tondo. I didn't know it was called that. A very elderly African gentleman in the audience watched me hold a 9-foot boa constrictor wrapped around my waist. And then as I slipped it back into its pillowcase and back into its cooler, I had a one-eyed Nicobar pigeon, African pigeon, on this finger, and then as I put that on its perch, this very large African tortoise wandered by. And so he sent his son and his grandson down to fetch me to the top of the theater and said, I will tell you a story from my country, which when he lived there was Congo, was later Zaire, was the Belgian Congo when his father lived there. And I told a very bad version of it for probably 6 or 8 months until a woman in my graduate school class said, that thing you do at the zoo, there are other people who do it, you know, and gave me a flyer for Jonesboro.
Ah.
And so I flew to Jonesboro knowing nothing about storytelling, and after a weekend went, oh, that's what I know. And while I was there, I bought the book Traveling to Tondo, because when I looked at it, I realized it was the good version of what I was doing. I heard a young woman tell it at the swapping ground. And then while I was in Tennessee, which is where Jonesboro is, I got a flyer for Sharing the Fire, and that's how I started storytelling in Boston.
Sharing the Fire being the New England Storytelling Conference.
And Jonesboro being the National Storytelling Festival, which is the gathering of storytellers nationally that comes up in
First weekend in October.
Right.
And they may be up to their 40th, 41st
and
annual.
it gathers 10 to 11,000 people.
It's an incomparable good time.
And I understand from an article that was recently in the Gazette that Joe Buchek is there telling this story.
Could well be. He's been there before.
And so you kind of were doing it, and then you found storytelling, and then you came back to Boston. A lot of your stories come from your own life and experience, but you've also selectively picked stories that are connected to your life, that are out there, kind of, too. How does that happen?
I wish I could explain better about my process. For someone who relies on words, I'm surprisingly inarticulate about where the inspiration comes from, except that I respond. It's kind of like being a drum, in the way that you respond to historical pieces, and you respond often to very tender pieces. I am like a drum for some stories, and I know. Easy for me to do hero stories. I'm always looking for heroes. I think everyone is a hero. I think everyone deserves to be saved by a hero, however unlikely, at least 75 times in their life, and minimally. And so I listen for those in myself. I watch for them in the world, and then I'm surprised when I tell something for a period of time to watch the hero position shift and change. So perspective changes over time.
So that when you tell a story about a hero, often the nature of the hero changes in the telling again.
Or the nature of the interaction changes, very much so.
As you spend more time with the story, as you think about it, as you let it resonate, I think that's the drum
very
analogy.
much. Also, as I get older,
oh well, then yes.
I'm not sure I give myself credit for wisdom, but I do say.
Christy's getting older. You and I aren't, but she is.
But experiencing more of the circle of life,
yes,
gives you a different perspective on things you've always known.
And I think that the advantage to it is I also draw my stories. And what I've discovered is when I draw my stories, obviously you start with all your characters and you sketch them. When I change where I stand in relation to each of them, my perspective about the story changes, and the telling of the story somewhat changes. So one of the pieces that I'm going to do at the Glenn Sanders has shifted a lot because of that technique. Has been very, very, I can't wait to tell it, actually.
You've let each of the characters speak, tell their story, and of course,
it has brought. It takes me out of the forefront. I mean, I'm certainly the central character because they're my stories, but it takes some people very much from out from behind the wings or at the back of the stage and brings them. It's like we all have an equal part in that, and that's where the shifting stuff happens. Sounds very esoteric, doesn't it? Ooh,
Yeah.
I'm not sure I think it all that well, but yeah. Yeah.
So you draw your stories, and that allows you to then kind of plot the interrelationships of the characters, and then you move them around, and that forces you to change your own perspective in the telling too.
It forces me sometimes to be more honest about the story than I might be otherwise.
Well, geez. Now this is true wisdom of storytelling. That little piece about sketching and changing the perspective.
Well, it's also good about life. That
Oh,
if,
yeah.
if you think about someone who's perhaps ticked you off, and then you think about their life from their perspective, you might get a certain amount of insight and understand maybe that you were accidentally pushing one of their buttons, perhaps, or
It's why I like unlikely heroes so much. You know, animals or people who stand in a story in a way that people think they will be one way, and then they turn out to be dramatically different.
We've talked a lot
yes.
about story as a process in an abstract way. You've probably got more than one story for us, but we'd love if you told it. And then after you tell it, we'll continue some of the weave of some of these methods and see how they played out.
I would love to tell a story. I just love it. I heard Alison Krauss recently on a recording, and she said, "I'm so glad to be here tonight to play music for you because it's my job." And I thought, I get that. I love to tell. Okay. This one doesn't have a name, and I'm willing to take names. I have a hard time naming them. I love telling them. I don't name them well. If I had 10 children, they'd all be "Hey You." My parents were a little bit radical in their parenting techniques. They kind of subscribed to the wolf theory. You know, you give them a warm den and a lot of other furry creatures to play with and enough food, and give them an occasional, smack and a little nip, and they'll grow up just fine, and mostly it worked out. But the one thing they did do, the most structured thing they did, was we had dinner together every night. This is an anomaly now, but then it was very common. And at dinner every night, from pretty much the time any one of us could read, and there were 6 kids, as soon as we could read, we would read something in the newspaper and come to the dining room table prepared to tell about it. And the telling about it shifted as we got older. And by the time we were about 11, my father wanted us to move to the editorial page. And then we needed to come with an editorial about which we'd done some research. And then periodically in the middle of dinner, he would go, "Okay, switch sides." And so this makes you very facile in lying, if not in good finding. So I grew up believing that everyone at the table had the right to an opinion. I'm sure my opinions reflected my parents a great deal. I was, 11, 12, 13. But by the time I was 13, and my extended family was also similar and very verbal. So I thought 13-year-olds were as entitled to have political opinions at the table as anyone else. And so when I was just shy of 13, my parents moved from New York City to a small town on Long Island, about 1.5 miles long, half a mile wide, population 400 people. Very odd. And I'm a friendly girl, and it was the 8th grade, and people were very nice, even though I was the new kid. It kind of broke all the rules about not being nice to the new kid. And at about the end of the 8th grade, one of the most popular girls in my class invited me to lunch on Saturday. Shelley was everything I hoped to be. She had this perfect curly hair that did what she wanted, and it went in a perfect 1963, because that was the year, flip with a little bow, and her clothes were impeccable and always tidy. And she had a great smile, and she was a JV cheerleader and really, really smart and nice, and I thought, wow, okay, I've got it made. And so on the appointed Saturday, I went to her house for lunch, and it was the perfect kind of house. Joe and Kate have heard stories about my house with 27 cats, 9 dogs, a boa constrictor, It was messy and untidy. My mother was a painter. My father was also a painter. So it was unpredictable and loud and noisy. Her house wasn't. It was beautiful and clean and neat, and lunch was not kind of an ersatz thrown together leftovers, but Campbell's tomato soup and a tuna fish sandwich on white bread, and a glass of milk on a perfectly set table. And it was her mother and father and me and Shelley and her brother, whose name I think was Brian, but I'm not sure. I thought I had died and gone to heaven, and I was so excited. And I did my very best, and I didn't cross my legs, and I didn't put my elbows on the table, and I didn't slurp my soup. But I did, in fact, volunteer an opinion. When her father said something to her mother, somewhat semi-political, I piped up with what I thought was a good opinion. And then her mother said something to her father, and I piped up and thought it was kind of a good opinion. And in about no time, it seemed that nobody else was talking, and that was kind of horrifying. And I went home, and I was never asked back again. And I was absolutely crushed. And I couldn't figure out what I had done wrong. But I was in the 8th grade, and I was resilient, and I had lots of friends. And so I moved on. At the end of the 9th grade, my school went out on strike. There was a dress code, a very strict dress code. Locust Valley High School is on the North Shore of Long Island and very Republican. And so girls were not allowed to have skirts above their knee, and boys had to wear socks, and they couldn't have hair down below their collar. And we decided to protest. And the protest centered around one young man, Claude Thibault, who was a senior, from France. He was very French and very handsome. And not only was he sophisticated and very French and very handsome, but he was also a star athlete. And they were not going to let him play because he wouldn't cut his hair. And this was outrageous to us. And so the school went out on strike. We walked out of high school. We walked out of high school and stood around. And it was a scandal. It was a scandal in 1965, I think it was. And the newspaper came, Newsday came, and the radio came, and eventually the vice principal quit, and there was quite a to-do. But while we're standing out there, I had called my mother to let her know on the payphone what was happening, and my mother, bless her, I come from a card-carrying, union card-carrying family of Democrats, arrived with a picnic basket of food for me and my friends. Yay, Mom, in her old Volkswagen with her paint-stained jeans rolled up at the bottom, cigarette in a cigarette holder. And she delivered the food, and you have some moments when you're proud of your parents when you're young. Mostly they annoy you, but this was one of her really good ones. And then behind her pulled up a red sedan, much newer than my mother's Volkswagen, and out of the car got Mrs. Principe, Shelley's mother. And I looked at her and I thought, well, maybe, because I had figured out there was probably a difference between her parents and mine, but maybe, I thought, sitting there with my friends Maureen and Carol, maybe we weren't so different, and maybe we could be friends. Maybe her mother was going to give her lunch too, and maybe her mother and my mother would have a chat. And then her mother grabbed her by the hair and began to smack her and dragged her into the car, screaming about what an embarrassment she was to her family. And my heart broke. It broke for her, it broke for me because I knew we would never be friends. And it let me see my parents, their odd, quirky, avant-garde, Greenwich Village hippie ways, as something I was glad to live with. They were a little bit crazy, but they would never do that. They were to the left of center and sometimes embarrassing, but they would never do that. And it was in that moment I knew that being raised like a wolf might not be the worst thing in the world.
Wow, wow, wow.
And I would suggest that last phrase is your title, Being Raised by a Wolf.
Like a
Oh,
wolf.
that's an excellent idea. Thank you. Thank you very much. So that's been an anecdote. I think I've told it once or twice, but I realize I work with teens a lot in the schools as part of another job that I do. And understanding that kind of where you stand in your family and where your family stands in the world and what you get to carry with you and what's important and what not and what's important on the outside and inside are very important. So I think this will turn up in my work.
Wow. Wow.
I never anticipated Shelley's mom acting so atrociously.
It was so out of that button-down, very quiet veneer. It was horrifying. It was like watching a monster an alien split her skin. And whatever she held dear was definitely threatened. In the years since, I have come, as a parent, to occasionally understand that your children can push you to the edge of a precipice. But not like that. And for as avant-garde and interesting as my parents were, and sometimes outrageous, I could no more imagine them doing that than I could imagine.
It's
Embarrassing me in some other way, yes, but not like that.
that was more than
An
embarrassing.
It was heartbreaking. It was heartbreaking.
And one wonders how often
That
happened.
Yeah, it was that. It was the idea that this was a permissible way to deal with children that had not occurred to me.
Yeah. Yeah.
No. So, and I think in many ways that informed a great deal of how I parented, not just how my parents did, but how I did. You know, I never spanked my son. I never. It would even in his most maddening stand on the bed in your work boot, play your guitar kind of ways. That would never have occurred to me.
Oh, jeez.
And I've often thought what life might have been like for her afterwards and what that was like.
Now, when you drew that story, were there or will there be situations where you change the perspective of the characters in that story?
Yeah, I think I think that's what's actually happening now. When I first started out, there's a drawing of me kind of walking down the hall and all these kids I don't know. So there's like this big divide, and then there's a picture of me and Shelley inviting me, and there's a picture of me at her dining room table, and believe me, these are not fine art. These are not anything my parents would have produced. And then there's a picture of me kind of walking away from her house. We lived on the same road, kind of walking home. There's a picture of me with other people, and then there's this kind of huge crowd around the school, and there's a picture of my mother and myself and my two friends, and my mom with a picnic basket, and there's a picture of Shelley and her mother. And I was resketching recently, this is an interesting thing, I was resketching me closer to where they were. And I don't know if that speaks to my wishing I had figured out a way to intervene or that some other adult had, I think is what. I cannot imagine that at 15 I would have had my act together enough to even have a clue what to do. Plus, I wouldn't have. But even there's a part of me that wanted my mother to do something, although she was, I think, more shocked than I was. Or somebody. And that was, in this thing, there's a much larger circle of nobody around the two of them. So, yeah.
Well, there's a reference in that in something that I read in the paper Sunday, and it was one of the advice columns. But the article, the letter had come in from somebody who had witnessed bullying in school. And in effect, this is bullying, right? And the commentator said the victim in a bullying situation isn't necessarily the one being bullied, it's the witness.
That's right. People are afraid.
And that issue that there isn't really a third person disinterested when bullying occurs. And that's the reality, because you're still living with the fact that this happened to someone who you admired, wanted to be friends with, and you haven't yet resolved the situation.
No, and this is almost 50 years later.
Yeah.
Almost 50 years later, some part of that informs some of the other work that I do, in that I really understood that I was powerless in that situation and really angry about it. As a kid, and as was she, I think a lot of my empathy went to her, but when I talk to teens now about being allies rather than bystanders, which I consider a really passive role and allies being a more active one, what I hope is that they can together, I tell them to do it together, get past the place where you're afraid to do something. And also, her mother, as hard as, and this is the place where I'm stuck, her mother must have felt some enormous fear about her social status or her position in the world to have had that be a response to something her daughter was doing, which can't possibly embarrass you. Your kids are going to do a host of things that don't reflect on you, that have nothing to do with you.
But I mean, she could have been brought up that way. She could have been in a tenuous social position. I mean, there's her husband could have come from a socially prestigious family and she didn't, so that might have been the tightrope she was walking. Who knows what his job was, that they needed to be the perfect family. Of course, screaming and hitting your daughter and dragging her into a car isn't keeping up the front.
No, we're not keeping up appearances, to quote Mrs. Bucket. Mrs. Bouquet.
No, it's
I got that.
You got the reference. I knew you would.
It went around a couple times,
and
but
then it came back.
Then it
On the other hand, when I've only worked that story once with a group of kids, and it was very interesting to get their perspective on it. So that's where I try out that kind of story. By the way, not all my stories are quite so heavy, but that is where I try them out sometimes.
You might just
It's cheaper than therapy. Oh,
yeah.
Lord.
While we're at this, just for our viewers, you might explain what you do professionally, because we've talked around it, but you really.
I have a job that I think I was made to do and am enormously lucky to do. For the last 15 years, I've worked for a domestic violence and rape crisis agency. And in that time, I've run the shelter for quite a long time, was a rape crisis program coordinator. I'm currently the legal advocate. When I do education in schools, it's primarily around sexual violence prevention and the legal system. And that's what I do.
So when you describe working with kids, it's in the context of a
Primarily-
number of situations that are.
Well, middle and high schoolers in classroom settings, and then also if we have occasion to help minors seek orders of protection in family court or that kind of thing. Yeah.
Very valuable.
Valuable work. Valuable work. And informed by that attitude of the mom and dad who drove the Volkswagen. Right?
Very, very much.
Yeah.
So. Well, before we go on with Christie's fascinating stories,
yes.
we need to touch base on the coming attractions.
And there are attractions.
Yes. Now, we're starting out our seasons at both Proctor's and the Glenn Sanders Mansion. Our 7th season at Proctor's starts off October 1st. Hope you're getting to hear this in time to come. One of our free programs at Proctor's, our pre-show spoken word programs, happen before an event on the main stage. And the storytelling that happens an hour beforehand is connected, resonates a bit with what's happening on stage. So Diana Krall is going to be on the main stage at 8 o'clock. At 7 o'clock in Robb Alley, which is the area near the box office in Proctor's, I will be telling stories with Eileen Mack on the Great American Songbook. So I'll be telling
stories of people who make music?
Cole Porter and the Gershwin brothers, and maybe I'll have, I only get 15 minutes of that 30. So maybe that's all I'll be
Hard
able
to say your name in 15 minutes, isn't it, Christy?
So
That will be fabulous.
So if you're coming to Proctor's, you can pick that up before you take your seat in the big theater, or if you're just in downtown Schenectady, you want to get a little taste of storytelling and be in the crowd, you can pick up the storytelling and then go have a burger at Pinhead Susan's or at the bistro next door, Aperitivo. It's a happening place.
And we'll be giving away some pairs of free tickets to our other series at Proctor's, word plays. So do come.
Okay.
Now, the following Sunday, October 6th, Christy Keegan will be with Marnie Gillard telling stories about heroines and tricksters. Glenn Sanders Mansion, it will be our 105th Story Sunday.
Wow. Triple figures. Who would
Yes.
have thought?
Who'd have thought?
Who'd have thought?
Where you get 4 courses of stories interwoven with 3 courses of food. And there's more information on our website, story-circle.org. But you do need to make a reservation because your meals need to be cooked. And
there are 3 menu choices. We do limit the menu choices just to handle the logistics. But they're top-notch offerings from Angelo Mazzone and his crew, who have really gone out of their way to make us feel welcome over the years there and make our listeners feel welcome. So if you haven't tried it yet, bring mom or dad out for a festive time.
No, bring your whole book club.
Bring the whole
Your whole Red Hat ladies group. Whatever. Then we will be having our first word play at Proctor's up in the gallery. It's the area above the box office, and each word play has a title, and all the stories link into the title some way. And we have 6 to 9 different tellers each session. On October 20th at 2 p.m., The topic is life and death.
Oof.
And we have 8 tellers telling stories, some personal stories, some folk tales, some historical stories.
And this is a wonderful place to catch up with what's going on with the Green Market in downtown Schenectady, because it's Sunday afternoon at 2. So you can graze the Green Market, which will still be outdoors over around City Hall, and then head on over and enjoy some wonderful stories. And at intermission, we have some wonderful goodies. So it's fun to come and hear the stories and eat the cookies.
Okay. Then this slide is about the Online Storytelling Festival organized by Sue O'Halloran in Chicago, October 9th through 11th. It's on Facebook, but you don't have to be a member of Facebook. It's open to the public. Go to facebook.com/storiesconnectusalL. And what she's done at various gatherings of storytellers is to film them telling their stories, and it's even more intimate than we get here. It's a real close-up, and if you have these videos fill your whole screen, it's quite a different experience. That even though they're canned stories. Motoko. I watched Motoko on this website. There are other stories that were used last year. She tells the story of being a teenager, and she was popular because of her hair. Motoko is from Japan, and she has shining black hair, but when she was a teenager, it went all the way down to her waist.
Wow.
And it was a wonderful experience just living with that shimmering curtain, until the evening when a man attacked her because of that. She was just frightened and pushed to the ground, and then he left. But the next day she had her hair cut, and she's never had it long since then. So,
well, that sounds like a real service to storytelling, and it sounds like it's easy to do for people.
yes.
And we haven't had Motoko on our show, but she's a lovely person, and if you wanted your computer screen filled with a lovely person, I couldn't think of anybody else. It'd be much better than having me, for example.
Oh,
No.
please don't dump on yourself.
What's easy?
We'll do that for
We'll
you.
do that for you.
So there are all kinds of stories from all kinds of tellers from across the country. So I highly recommend some of the best storytellers from around the country. We have some fine storytellers here. There are fine storytellers all around the country. And then there's our slide about our YouTube channel, which I explained before, storycircle@proctors.org. Click on YouTube. You can find the Tondo story.
Oh, that's right. That's right.
That's
Wow.
on there. Joe tells stories on it. I tell a story on it. So those are the events that I know about in October. Do you have anything up your sleeve, Joe?
I have several things up my sleeve, none of which I can remember at this point in time. I do have a little bit of a pitch. One of the fun projects that I did this summer in August was Harlan Ratmeyer, who is one of our storytelling folks, the chaplain at Albany Med, had a 75th birthday party. And he had it right on the church lawn, and Reggie Harris and Kim Harris came and entertained us. And everybody who came to the party got a copy of a CD of all the stories that Harlan, Kent, and I have told, all of Harlan's stories, 2 CDs. And it is a wonderful, wonderful CD. And I would love people, if they'd like a copy, to contact me at aldenjoe.nicap@nicap.rr.com, and they're $15, and they will be a benefit for the building fund at Harlan's Church down in Selkirk, the First Reformed Church of Bethlehem. But it's got all of the things in one place, and it's got some lovely pictures of Harlan and his rototiller, and Harlan sticking out of his Mini Cooper.
Not when he's driving, please.
No, not when he's,
Not
he's driving. Harlan and his lovely wife Ellen, and one of his stories was about a young son of good friends, one of the pastors he's mentored, and it's called Jacob Dances in Hope. And he's got a picture of Jacob and his little sister in a wagon being pulled by his tractor. And so it's just scrumptious, folks, and we'd love to get that around, and we do have some fundraising copies available.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, if you haven't gone to the Glenn Sanders Mansion and heard the Three Spirits annual performance there, that's Joe, Harlan, and Kent Bushman, you have missed a lot. But you can catch up by getting these CDs.
That's right. This is a collector's item, and we were pleased to do it. Actually, Alan Bartenhagen, who's our sound guy, and I had more fun putting this together because it was just fun. I had to ride around and listen to them all the time while I was trying to put them together.
Okay, well, I think we should go to Christie's next story. We have about 18 minutes left, so we don't want to. You don't have to take it all.
No.
Christy.
I'm trying to winnow down in my mind. Yes. Winnowing. Let me see. Let me see. I have a favorite, although I might tell this at Story Sunday. I'm wrestling with time as always, but because it's one of my fun ones and I love telling it, may I tell it?
Certainly.
Okay, it's called Crushed Crab. I was riding my bike as fast as I could. I was late for dinner again. I was chronically late for dinner, and it drove my parents crazy. I came around the curve of the creek where my parents lived. My knees were pumping up and down, up and down, up and down, and my white Keds on those black pedals were going so fast they were kind of a gray blur. I had my sights fixed on a point about a third of the way up our driveway, which was about a quarter mile long and about a 45-degree angle. I never made it all the way up. It was my sincerest and fondest hope that someday I would. And so what I would do was ride as fast as I could and look at the point and try and make it to the point. And I was so concentrating on catching up and being on time and making it up the hill that I sort of felt and heard the squish and crunch before I saw it, and when I looked down, I stood on my brakes really hard and then put my brand new white Keds right down into the middle of a crushed and very wet horseshoe crab. They were everywhere, all around me. I couldn't figure out why. All the way from before my parents' driveway to Cat Hollow Road, which is the next road over, the road was littered with dead and dying horseshoe crabs. I love horseshoe crabs. The very first one I ever collected, I was no more than 5. I found a little tiny carapace, no bigger than my dad's thumbnail, and I dried it, and it had been on the mantle ever since. And now my collection at the time of this story went from little tiny all the way up to dinner plate size, and there was no reason for them to be on the road. Every once in a while, my parents lived at the beach. One or two would get confused after mating, and they'd climb across this narrow beach and end up on the road, but everybody in town would scoop them up and take them back to the water and slip them in where they belonged. And I thought, well, maybe it was a full moon or a high tide or hundreds and hundreds of them, and I was so sad. I started to cry. I forgot about dinner. I forgot about the driveway. Instead, I put down my kickstand, and very gently and carefully as I could, I picked up each one and I piled them in the basket of the bicycle, and I wheeled it across the parking lot to the great big 55-gallon drum at the end of the town pier. And I put them in carefully on top of the newspapers all littered with fish scales and fish heads. And 3 or 4 trips it took to clear up as many as I could, and I was covered in crushed crab guts and sobbing. And by the time I wheeled my bike up, I'd long missed dinner. And I explained to my father what had happened, and nobody was mad. My mother washed out my clothes, and no one could figure it out either. We thought it was just some weird anomaly. By the next morning, I put on my slightly damp favorite shorts that I wore all the time and my shirt, and I took my bike back down to the bottom of our driveway. It was way more fun going down at the end, and as I scooted to the end and went to turn right, I could hear them. Not the crabs again, something else, a sound that was unmistakable, the hooting and hollering of boys. I was just 13. Boys were not high on my list of things I wanted to hear, hooting and hollering. And I thought I could see at the end of the parking lot, 3 of them doing something I thought I could figure out. So I wheeled across the little tiny pebbles and went around the side of the lifeguard shack and made it halfway across the parking lot, and I could see them. It was George and Billy and one of their friends, the neighborhood bullies. George had a big horseshoe crab in his hand. He had it over his head and he smashed it down on the ground, and they whoa at the top of their lungs, and I was pissed. 2 more times before I could even make my feet move. I started to ride towards them and I screamed, "Cut that out! Put that down now! You can't do that!" in a way that only a skinny little red hair, freckled, kind of all knees and elbows girl can do. They looked at me. "Put it down," said George. "I'll put it down." He picked up a really big one and smashed it on the ground twice. I was furious. "Don't you dare!" I rode as hard as I could. I rode right up to George, and then I rode right up him. Right up his naked leg to the edge of his shorts. I pushed him down on the ground, and then I jumped off my bike and onto him. And I punched him as hard as my cousins had taught me how to without putting my thumbs inside so they wouldn't break. And I whomped him, and I whomped him, and I whomped him. And all of a sudden I realized what I was doing, which was not something my mother would have approved of. I didn't think, although on balance, crabs, George. But I hopped off, and I was not going to cry in front of those boys, even though what I wanted to do more than anything right then was cry. My hands hurt, my heart hurt. I didn't know what to do, and my father was nowhere around. And I realized that they were much bigger than me, way much bigger than me. However, something about how I looked and how I wiped underneath my nose and how I wiped the blood and the snot on my shorts made them wonder just what it was about me that was so scary. They backed up, turned around and ran, grabbed their bikes, and took off. Once again, I gathered up all of those crab bodies, and I piled them all in the 55-gallon drum, which at this point was pretty much full. And I wheeled my way back up to my parents' house before lunch. It was a Saturday. My father was home. So I explained what happened, and while I sobbed in his arms, he explained to me that there were people that were mean, that I had done the right thing, that even though I had hit George as hard as I could and made him bleed, and even though I had left tire tracks on his leg, which is not something he would ordinarily have approved of, in this case, there was an argument to be made for my behavior. George and I did eventually get to be friends, about 2 years later. He never apologized for what he did, but as far as I know, he never killed another crab.
Never boring being around Christy, I'll tell you. You never know when she's going to draw blood right on the...
Hell on Wheels is, you sure that isn't good?
That may be, yeah. Hell on Wheels.
Crushed Crabs is a good title.
I like
Fresh
it.
crabs.
Yes.
Wow.
I will be forever grateful to my 4 boy cousins. We were all born within 2 years of each other, and they taught me to climb trees and run as fast as I could, usually away from them, to punch, to fight. You know.
Wow. Wow.
There are pictures of me in full boxing position.
Man, oh man. I can only imagine what your high school reunions are like.
Entertaining. My class doesn't have them. My friend Linda, who's a year older than I, my oldest friend in the world, her class has them, so I go to hers.
Oh.
My class has given up. 35 years ago they gave up.
Oh.
Huh.
Yeah, very sad. But her class is great, so I borrow hers.
Yeah.
I don't know where to go with
well,
that.
no, I wonder how did you and George ever become friends?
I think he felt badly, is my guess. His best friend lived across the street from my parents, with his parents, and George would go by, and I glared for a long time. And think he probably felt bad because he turned out actually to be a very nice kid with a kind of an odd family life. And we actually became friends one night. I was coming back from the beach, and he and his friend were going down, whose last name was Donahue, and I cannot remember his first name. It'll come. We're going down to the beach, and I don't know if I just declared a moratorium on glaring, or it just wasn't worth the effort to stay angry anymore. I was 15 by then, immature, and he was kind of cute. So I could forgive a lot of things for that. And so he kind of nodded, and I nodded. And I remember it very clearly because it was definitely détente. It wasn't, peace accord, but it was détente. We nodded, and a couple, 3 weeks later, before the end of the summer, he came into my parents' front yard, and I was sitting on the front steps, and just kind of asked how I was and petted the dog. And from there, it got actually to be a good friendship. He would often come, and we'd sit on the porch at night and talk. And we never dated. It wasn't that kind of relationship. But I found out a lot about his family that probably explained a lot about him. And he actually, it was awful. He died young. He slipped off the roof and fell and died, which was horrific. And I really mourned him because he was a good guy who behaved badly. I don't know, it was a mob mentality. I don't know what it was. He was 13 and not necessarily as smart as he might have been. And I don't know what happened in the intervening years. So, but I was grateful for that. I probably could have hated him forever, but I don't really have the makeup to do that. It's too much work. Which actually, it is good that you asked, because I realize now, telling that I will now draw that, because that actually is a piece of the story, that it's not really worth hating somebody for a long time. Thank you. Okay, so that ends that. Thank you.
Wow. Well, you certainly cover a lot of ground when you tell a story, and I think that's
bicycle.
That bicycle, yeah. And the interesting things about these stories is that you kind of repeat the crisis in this one. Usually we say stories have a crisis and it gets resolved. And you hit the first crisis and resolved it, and then it revisited you and the situation and the story. And it was so much more additive to the story the second time around. I mean, just really set it up well.
I think that's also what drove my anger was, that powerlessness that I described in the first story. I think, it's kids. I think you spend a lot of time feeling like, I don't know what the heck's going on. As an adult, I spend a lot of time going, I don't know what the heck's going on. And being confronted with it so close to the first event, I think was what made me so incredibly angry, because I did think I'd resolved it. I thought it was a natural occurrence. I thought everybody was safe. All my crabs were safe. I was safe. Life was good. And it wasn't. And I think it was that response. What do you mean I'm not safe? What do you mean my crabs aren't safe? But then I think about people who live in war-torn areas, and they do that every day in and day out and day in and day out and day in and day out forever. No wonder they get head ornery, Yeah. I get it.
Oh. Yeah. Wow.
I can tell you a funny one. I can tell you a funny story of retribution. It's very short.
Of retribution. Okay.
Very, very short.
We have less than 6 minutes.
Okay, this is very short, and I'll do it as an anecdote, really. So at the zoo, my friend Lynn was the person who knew most about the gorillas, except for their keeper, Dave Linehan. Yes. And I loved on my lunch hour to go and watch Lynn talk to people about the gorillas. And she taught people to not look them directly in the eye and how to approach them properly. And most of the time, 99% of the time, she got a great response. And so the female gorillas would play patty cake with children, and people would sit in front of them, and no one would look directly at the silverback, and nobody would be frightened, and they wouldn't fly at the glass and bounce off it and thump their chest. But every once in a while, somebody would show up. And I have to say, it was always a man, who would thump his chest as loud as he could, which was an automatic trigger for the adult silverback to run at the glass and defend the women and children in his troop. And sure enough, on this particular day, during my lunch hour, a fella did it. And Lynn said to him, please don't do that. It alarms the gorillas. It angers the silverback. Come on, he doesn't care. And so the very quick version is he walked from this large plexiglass plate overlook to an open overlook around the corner. And Lynn grabbed me by the arm and said, come with me. At the same time, she called security. And so we get around the overlook, and it's this vast, wide expanse with a moat and a very deep fence. The guy is thumping, and the African tropical forest in the Franklin Park Zoo echoes. You know, when the pumas roar, it echoes, and when the gorillas, you know, when this guy says, whoa, blah, 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 it's echoing and reverberating, and the gorilla is hooting and clearly really distressed. It would be like someone coming into my house, you know, and doing this, and the guy just is laughing, and he thought it was hysterical, and all of a sudden Lynn grabbed me again and said, move back, and very calmly. And I thought with great dignity, the gorilla kind of squatted, shat in his hand, took aim, and got the guy right in mid, boom. It was all I could do to fall over. I laughed so hard, I slid down the wall and ended up crying. Lynn was hysterical, waiting for the security guy to come to throw the guy out, and the man was furious at us. Why are you laughing? You should be getting me a paper towel. I'm going to sue the zoo. For what? And I don't have any paper towels. He walked off swearing. Security escorted him off. But I thought, you know, sometimes some animals may not need our intervention. So there. I'm very fond of that story. Kate knew what was coming.
Yes, I somehow I remembered that story.
Yeah, it's distinctive.
Yes.
I am very fond of that story.
Is this the name? Is my fondest memory from the zoo?
It should be.
Or
just desserts is what I like to call it.
Well, that was
Now, folks, when I commented that we had traveled a long ways, you thought the trip was over, didn't you?
Oh, no.
No, never with Christy.
Never
Never with Christy. Just a little bit of a piece de resistance. Wow. Well, it's been a wild, wonderful hour.
Thank you.
An hour.
I love coming here. This is a great show.
And well, thank you. We kind of enjoy having you. And for a couple of other things that you should know about storytelling. Christy and a couple of her friends in Saratoga have started an open mic.
Janine Laverty and Margaret French.
At Cafe Lena, and it's the first Wednesday of the month.
Second Wednesday of the month.
Well, I know it was
every other month.
Second Wednesday
at
month
Lena's.
at 7 o'clock. And if you want to tell, you show up a little early and get on the tell. There's a featured teller, and that's
on the the odd months or something or other. On the even that's at Cafe Lena.
Yes. Cafe
And on the
Lena's.
even months in October, and there you are now seeing the slide that I have yet to make, but through the magic of television production, it will be there. That in October, it will be at our alternate location, which is in the Wesley Common in their Harkness building, which is behind Hospice, if you know where Hospice is.
over on the west side of
West side,
Saratoga,
yes.
near Skidmore
Yeah.
campus.
And then it's just an open mic for storytelling. Telling only, no reading, please.
No reading. But,
And only $3 at Lena's, which is a great deal.
yeah, and
Yes.
and
free at Wesley.
so that's the Saratoga outlet. If you're living in the Capital District, we meet at the Colonie Library, the Sanford Library, where we're filming the show, on the
Odd months.
odd months. That's the third Wednesday. No,
Third Tuesday.
third Tuesday.
Okay. We'll have a
we'll have a
slide on this too. Yes.
And you could just show up and get plugged in, listen, tell. Many of our members bring stories that are in development to try out, and it's fun. And on the other even months, we meet over at the Albany Public Library in Pine Hills. So there you go. And that's right near a few great pubs that I've heard about.
Well, it's time to say goodbye. We thank you very much for joining us and story by story, sharing the human experience. I'm Kate Dudding. And
I'm Joe Doolittle, and you all have a great rest of the month. Thanks so much.
It goes all my life's a circle, sunrise and sundown. The moon rolls through the nighttime till the daybreak comes around. And all my life's a circle, but I can't tell you why. Seasons stay